And thank you all who are listening for attending. I just want to say a word about how I got into the work that I'm doing, that I'm going to be talking about today. When I was in graduate school, actually at the University of Minnesota, I began to notice in some of my practicum placements that there were times when I would be involved in doing a psychological assessment with a client, and the client actually seemed to improve in significant ways just from the assessment. And this intrigued me because I had never really heard about this happening. I remember going back and talking to my professors at the University of Minnesota about whether they had ever heard about this. And I decided at that point that I wanted to learn more about how assessment could actually change people's lives. And in 1984, I graduated and got a faculty position at the University of Texas in Austin, and I began a series of research projects and clinical experiments with clients that have resulted in the method that we now call therapeutic assessment. And along the way, I found other colleagues who were working collaboratively with clients in assessment. I'll say a little bit more about them later. But what you're going to hear about today is really the product of about 35 years of thinking about assessment and how it can be life-changing for clients. And I also get to talk about the MMPI, which is another great love of mine. As you might imagine, training at University of Minnesota, we were well trained in the MMPI, and it's been a good friend and a very important tool for me in my entire career. So again, thank you for coming. I want to start with just a few polls that will help me tailor my presentation a little bit. So if you could all please reply on your screen, do you regularly use the MMPI-2-RF? Just would like to get a sense of how many people are familiar with the instrument. Responses are coming in. Okay. And it looks like we're about 60%, 40%. Okay. Great. That will help me. So, and then how many of you have heard about therapeutic assessment before or read anything? Is this the first time you're learning about it? If you could let me know. Okay. Okay, and here we're way tipped. So looks like most people are knowledgeable about therapeutic assessment. Makes sense. That's why you are coming to this webinar, possibly. So, okay. Well, even so, let me start for the people who are not that knowledgeable about therapeutic assessment, really talking about what therapeutic assessment is. So it's a semi-structured form of collaborative psychological assessment, which is work that was done by other people before me, Constance Fisher, Leonard Handler, Caroline Purvis, and others. And the basic idea of collaborative assessment is that clients are enlisted as collaborators in all phases of the assessment, from setting the goals, the test interpretation, the feedback, they review written reports, and they decide how to disseminate results. And therapeutic assessment was a semi-structured model of collaborative assessment where our goal is to use psychological testing not only for diagnosis and treatment planning, but also as the centerpiece of a brief, empirically validated therapeutic intervention. We want to leave clients different at the end of the assessment than when they came in. And you can still do diagnosis and treatment planning with a therapeutic assessment, but we try to achieve something more than that. Many TAs are as short as 2 to 3 sessions, and a lot of the research on TA involves that few number of sessions. And so you can imagine in settings with very high service demands and long waiting lists, if you have people trained in therapeutic assessment, it can be a useful way to deliver something valuable to a lot of clients in a short period of time. And more involved TAs can be 8 to 10 to 12 sessions. I can say more about that in the questions if you're interested. But it is a brief form of intervention which also yields the standard information that we get from an assessment. There are now over 35 published studies of collaborative and therapeutic assessment, and they involve a variety of clients and clinical problems and settings and research designs. If we had time, I could go into them in more detail. But in general, there are two kinds of effects that have been found. First, sometimes even a very brief TA, 2-session TA, will lead to decreases in reported or observed symptoms, increased self-esteem. Clients are more hopeful about the future and about the ability of mental health professionals to help them with their problems. We see increases in daily functioning. And in our research on children and families, we see better family relationships, and with couples also. Also, people report increased satisfaction, not only with the assessment as compared to a more traditional assessment, but with current or subsequent treatment that they're involved in. And you see better compliance with treatment recommendations as opposed to clients who haven't done a collaborative assessment. Greater alliance with treatment professionals, and an increased rate of change in therapy. We have a study published a couple of years ago of clients in the middle of therapy, a repeated measure single or sort of time series design, and what we found was after the therapeutic assessment was completed, the clients began to improve in the therapy at an increased rate from before they had the therapeutic assessment. Now, in 2010, Poston and Hansen published a meta-analysis of psychological assessment as a therapeutic intervention. I want to be clear, not all these studies used the therapeutic assessment model, but in a way they could all be said to have used collaborative assessment because they all involved giving feedback to clients as the result of an assessment. And the results are this: the overall effect size for symptom reduction, self-esteem increase, daily functioning, etc., was 0.423, about a half a standard deviation. And the overall effect size for those process variables like increased alliance, satisfaction, follow-through for treatment recommendations was over a standard deviation, 1.12. And some comparable effect sizes from large meta-analyses of psychotherapy that I think are useful, from a well-known meta-analysis of substance abuse dependence treatment, 0.45, cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety disorder is one of our absolutely most effective treatments in terms of symptom reduction, 0.89. Psychotherapy in general, from the Bruce Wampold famous analysis of psychotherapy, 0.8. But the important thing here is all of these meta-analyses were looking at interventions that had many, many more hours of treatment. So the average number of sessions in these meta-analysis was somewhere around 15 or 20, whereas in the Poston and Hansen meta-analysis, it was about 2.3. So a very short intervention using psychological assessment can come close to producing effects for much longer treatments. Now, these are the conclusions that Poston and Hansen published, just to highlight them. Clinicians should seek out continuing education training related to these models of therapeutic and collaborative assessment, and those who engage in assessment and testing as usual may miss out, it seems, on a golden opportunity to affect client change. And they recommended that training programs in clinical counseling and school psychology begin teaching therapeutic models of assessment. And we know this is happening. And they also had something to say about reimbursement for psychological assessment, that competency benchmarks and guidelines for psychological assessment practice should be revisited to make sure they include key aspects of therapeutic models of assessment. And of course, I think that's why many of you are here today too, that you're interested in learning about this. How is it that such a brief intervention can produce lasting change? And to be quite frank, we're still figuring this out, but I wanted to let you in on our current thinking based on the research that's been done to date. And to grasp this, what you have to really start with is the idea that all of us have something, it's been called various things in psychology, a core schema about ourselves, core beliefs, or I like the phrase from social psychology, a narrative identity. And a researcher who I like reading a lot, Jonathan Adler, has called narrative identity the internalized evolving story that each person crafts to provide his or her life with a sense of purpose and unity. We all have this based on our life experiences. These stories are sometimes implicit, not necessarily conscious, but all of us have developed some way of parsing the world to make sense of it and making sense of our place in the world. Now, years of research in cognitive and clinical psychology have let us know that these evolved narratives that we all have are not so easy to change. As you all know, once we have developed a way of viewing ourselves in the world, we all tend to screen information in that corroborates the story that we already have and screen out information that disconfirms that story. And, how many of you have ever tried to pay a compliment to someone with low self-esteem? And many of us in psychotherapy have clients who come and say, I want to feel better about myself. But the first time we say something positive to them, you'll see them push that information away. It's not because they're being perverse or resistant, as some people might say, but because this self-verification motive, this tendency to keep affirming the way we see things so that we can feel comfortable in the world is a very powerful motive. And also, our psychiatric client stories, even when they're inaccurate about themselves, may be particularly resistant to change because they protect them from shame and disintegration. I saw a client a couple of weeks ago who really had a quite paranoid view of the world and came in and told me about how the people plotting against him were the reason why he hadn't been able to succeed in life. And it became very clear to me that this story was extremely important to him because if he didn't think this way, he would begin to feel a lot of shame about his lack of success in the world. So it was a very important story, and I could tell right away it wasn't going to be easy to change this. It served a lot of psychological purposes. Now, all psychotherapy, I believe, probably tries in some way to make changes in client stories about themselves. And a lot of our clients who come to see us have stories that were very useful at one point in their life, helped them adapt to the environment that they grew up in, but which cause problems later in life and limit them in important ways. So, think of your client who's been subject to a lot of abuse and neglect. No child can grow up in the world thinking, my parents are really flawed and I'm good. You couldn't, as a child, go to bed at night and wake up in the morning with that story. You'd be too scared all the time. And so generally we have to believe my parents are great, doing the best they can, and there must be something fundamentally wrong with me. So that story, which helped you adapt to an environment where you were growing up, if you carry it forward into life, could really limit you. And so if we want to change that story, we can't just try to say to the client, no, that's not true, the way you're thinking about yourself, look at this evidence here, and expect them to accept the story and start incorporating it, involving them in the process of co-editing and revising the story is going to be very important. And that's where the collaborative part of collaborative assessment comes in. Our test instruments can really help us figure out important things about clients' personality and adaptation in the world, but they may not be ready to accept that information because it conflicts with an important way that they thought about themselves. And if we could just wave a magic wand and revise that story, they would kind of fall apart because it's a whole new way to be in the world and think about themselves. Or they might feel tremendous shame. So involving the client in a process where they co-edit the story turns out to be essential for leading to real changes in narrative identity. Now, the other thing, when you help change client stories, they often experience potentially overwhelming emotions. So imagine that example I gave before, the client who comes to realize that they were, in fact, not flawed, but there was something very wrong with their family, and that this affected them, and even though their parents were doing the best they could, that they failed them in important ways. That client is going to go through a grief process of feeling sadness and anger, and there'll be positive parts of that too. And these stories, these emotions can be very, very difficult to cope with. And so another part of therapeutic assessment that we focus on a great deal is building the kind of relationship with clients at the beginning and throughout the assessment process where they feel held up by these powerful emotions that are getting released as they start to think differently about themselves in the world. If a client can't tolerate the emotional experience, the grief, the excitement, whatever, of thinking about themselves in a new way, they'll push the new story away and stick to their old story. They have to feel that you're holding them up in that emotional place as they begin to think in a new way. And that allows them to begin to change their story. Now, therapeutic assessment is a very particular way of thinking about tests. I mean, the concept that we have is that tests are empathy magnifiers, helping us get in our client's shoes, helping us understand the client's implicit narrative identity, stories about themselves, and then also giving us clues to where client stories are open to change. And I still marvel when I go to an MMPI-2-RF workshop with some of the great people, Paul Arbisi, Yossi Ben-Pora. If you listen to them talk, what they do is sort of get in the shoes of the client using the test. They know what it's like to be a client with a T-score of 80 on RCD. And it's from that place that we can speak to clients. Or if you hear Seth Grossman talk about the MCMI, he has a sense of what those scores mean in terms of a client's lived experience. And when you have that kind of information, you can talk to clients in a way that they feel very understood and heard, and you can help them with their tests. And so we do this not just with personality testing, but even with intellectual testing. What's it like to be a client with a verbal comprehension index of 130 and a working memory of 70? What does it mean to be that type of person? If you can figure that out through your testing, then you're ready to work with your clients in therapeutic assessment. Now, therapeutic assessment can be used with any valid test, and we also, talk later, use some softer tests in another step of therapeutic assessment. But I want to talk about why I like the MMPI-2-RF and how useful it can be, which is one of the reasons I agreed to do this webinar. It has established validity for a wide array of clinical problems. Many of you may have used the MMPI-2 for years and have had to transition to the RF. The empirical evidence for the RF is accruing rapidly and is really impressive. I also like the MMPI-2-RF because it's very easy to explain to clients. And the scales are face valid. The scale names can be used with clients. You know, with the MMPI-2, we always had to deal with, you know, I can't say schizophrenia or psychasthenia or hysteria. And so we were always trying to find ways. And the heterogeneous scales of the MMPI-2 can be used beautifully. Those of you who use the MMPI-2, you can continue using it. It's still a valid test. But you have to go through some pyrotechnics, I think, to be able to pull apart what the information is. And, of course, that's what code type analysis was about. There's very little clinician time required with a self-report test like the MMPI-2-RF, and, of course, with the 2-RF, very little client time to fill it out. And most clients find it quite easy to complete. As I said, the homogeneous scales are very easy to explain to clients. The profile graphs of the uniform T-scores that have known percentile ranks can make a very powerful impression. You don't just have to say you're high on this scale of low positive emotions. You can say you're at the 99th percentile or the 99.9 percentile. Only 1 in 1,000 people in the normative control group had scores this high. And because the scales are homogeneous, low scores can also be very meaningful. And the case that I chose to show you today really has a good illustration of that. So lower scores can show you affect states or personality traits that clients have inhibited or blocked, which can be important clues to why they're having certain difficulties in their lives. Now, in front of you, you should see a flow chart of therapeutic assessment with the MMPI-2-RF. I've put 6 steps in. The steps that are in dotted lines are really optional. You can do a fine therapeutic assessment without these steps, but the case example that I have is going to illustrate also step 3 and step 6. And rather than go through the steps right now, I'm going to go through them one at a time as I talk about them. So let's start with the initial session of a therapeutic assessment that uses the MMPI-2-RF as our main instrument. Now, in therapeutic assessment, this initial session is focused on building a collaborative frame with the client, letting the client know that he or she is going to be an essential participant in every part of the assessment. And this is a little different for some people who expect to sort of come, have something done to them, and have an expert in a white coat tell them about themselves. And so we don't give up our expertise, and we don't try to be friends with the client, but we let the client know that we need their input from beginning to end in the assessment. We also want to start building this good, safe relationship with the client where they feel accompanied, held up emotionally, their anxiety starts relaxing, they get the feeling right from the beginning that we're there to help them, we're not going to shame them, we're paying attention to their emotions and not doing anything that will make them too anxious. And then a major goal that we do in the first session of a therapeutic assessment is to help the client frame individualized questions that the client wants to have answered through the assessment that will guide the assessment. So in the initial session, I often begin saying, thank you. Did you have any questions about the process we're going through? And I answer any questions, and I say, great. So the main goal today is I want to know what questions or puzzles or problems you have that you're dealing with right now that you have not been able to solve or figure out in another way. And I hope by the end of the hour that we can come up with a short list of questions that you want to answer with me through the process of the assessment. I'll tell this to clients on the phone before they come, and some people arrive at the initial session with a little list of questions that they've already begun to work on, and I encourage them to do that. Some people don't, and so you work with them to come up with these questions. And even clients who come in with their own list of questions, often we work to shape those questions into questions that will be more meaningful. Now, this is an art itself, getting good questions, and we do whole 2-day workshops on just the initial session and how to build alliance. But I'll just leave you with this idea right now of asking the client what it is that he or she wants to learn about themselves as the main part of the initial session. As we get questions, we then collect relevant background information about the questions. So if the client says, I want to know how depressed I am, then I'll say, oh, okay, tell me a little bit more about that. And then I'll clarify words. So when you say depressed, what do you mean by depression? And I'll ask questions like, when did this begin, this problem? And is it the same all the time? What makes your depression better? What makes it worse? What will it mean to you if I say the test says you're very depressed? What would it mean if I said not so depressed? What's the worst possible thing we could learn through the assessment? All of these are ways that we can elaborate information based on the assessment questions that give us the client's context and begin to give us important historical information. In the initial session, we agree upon the contract for the assessment, so it's going to take this many sessions, this is what it's going to cost, and then we schedule the next assessment session. So the case I'm going to use today is one some of you who've come to our workshops have maybe seen me present because I have videos of it. It's from a live assessment that I did in 2009 in Denver. And the client was a 41-year-old woman referred by her licensed psychologist, PhD therapist, who had been seeing her for about 3.5 years of weekly cognitive behavioral therapy. And the client was seriously depressed, and the therapist, very responsible therapist, was very concerned because the client was not improving. And this is a therapist who generally had very good success with depressed clients working with CBT. And there had been some successes in the therapy. The client had been obese when she first came. She had lost weight and maintained it during the assessment, or during the therapy, but she had not been able to change her depression. She had an inpatient hospitalization 2 years previously for about 7 to 10 days when she was suicidal. When she came out, she went into intensive outpatient program for a little while and then went back to the outpatient therapy. And the therapist, when she made the referral, said, this is a client, with clearly negative fixed views of self that I have found very highly resistant to change. And the usual sort of collaborative empirical approach that I use in cognitive behavioral therapy of let's examine the evidence, and it doesn't seem to fit, et cetera, doesn't seem to work. So I need help. The client was fairly educated, a master's degree, and at the time that I saw her, she had just recently resigned from a job, and she told me, my bosses are happy with me, I'm getting good performance evaluations, but I constantly have this feeling of inadequacy and like I'm not living up to par, and it's causing me such anguish every day that I finally just decided to leave my job. I found her very open and curious in the initial interview. The therapist had told me, and I noticed, a kind of emotional constriction. Her range of affect was very narrow. She did tear up a little bit in the session, but was also very clear, a very internalizing client who blamed herself. Her hopelessness was very evident, and I could feel the depression in the room. These are the questions that we came up with in the initial session, working together. In work situations, why don't I feel like I'm contributing in spite of evidence to the contrary? And that fits with what I told you about her having resigned in spite of the performance reviews. What prevents me from seeing myself in positive ways? And the client was very aware that she was very hard on herself, tended to see herself very negatively, in spite of her therapist and other people telling her positive things. She just wasn't able to incorporate that information into her self-views. Excuse me. She asked me, what's keeping me from getting out more to do things? She was leading quite a restricted life at that point, going to therapy, occasionally getting together with friends, but she talked about feeling like she had to push through molasses to get out of the house, molasses that was up to her chin. Then something came up in the initial interview that I found interesting because the referring therapist had not mentioned it to me. The client asked, how can I move past the intense feelings of grief about my last romantic relationship? And it turned out that just before she had begun this recent bout of therapy, about 4 years prior to the assessment, there had been a very traumatic ending to a long romantic relationship she was involved in, where she was living with her partner. He had very suddenly ended the relationship and done it in really kind of a abrupt and not very respectful way, from what I could hear. Ms. P had moved and years later was still feeling a lot of longing to be back with this partner, really thinking a lot about what she had done wrong that might have ruined the relationship, and was really still in a great pain about it. And she knew this really sort of wasn't normal in some sense, but that just contributed to her feelings of inadequacy and shame. Now, in the next step in the flowchart, the client takes the MMPI-2-RF, and Ms. P filled out the MMPI-2, took her the average amount of time. And I just want to show you quickly the profile, and then we'll look at the MMPI-2-RF report that I got from Pearson at the time. As you can see, those of you who are users of the MMPI, so we have the validity scales for Rain and Tran are just fine. She read the items well and responded on the basis of item content. We see an elevation on the F scale. She's quite distressed, not a surprise given the presentation. FP is not high. These other scales are really not invalidating the profile. And she was not defensive in her responding at all. So this really says she tried to answer as openly and honestly as she could, and this is a client who's in some distress. The higher order scales tell us immediately what fits with the clinical presentation. This is a client whose major problems in living come from internalizing painful emotions. She doesn't have a major thought disorder. She is not somebody who acts out. In fact, if anything, she's lower in her behavioral acting out potential than the average client, a very internalizing client. And you can see in the restructured clinical scales a very high score, almost the highest possible score on demoralization. This is a client who is very demoralized, feeling very hopeless. She is miserable. And the highest possible score on RC2, this is a client with very low positive emotions. She's not feeling joy in life. There's nothing to get her up and make her feel good. Anhedonia is a prominent experience. Life is gray. She has a gray coat on that she's been wearing, and it weighs her down. She has a low score on RC3. Those of you familiar with the MMPI-2-RF, this is a cynicism scale. If she were up here, she would have cynical attitudes. When it's low here, we see a person who almost trusts too easily, gives people the benefit of the doubt, blames herself rather than other people. And Some other noteworthy scores, I think, are this very low RC9, almost the lowest possible score. This is a woman struggling with low energy, put together with this RCD and this RC2. This is a very painful, depleting depression. When I saw this, it was just, I felt it was remarkable that she had come for the assessment and that she was doing the things that she had done. We see there's a bunch of malaise. There are cognitive complaints, not at all in common with this kind of depression. And, really made me think about her leaving her job and saying that she didn't feel competent there. I think the lay public doesn't know about depression affecting the way we think, and they don't tend to think about that as a sign of depression, but she's sort of got mud in the wheels up there, and that's what it must feel like. And this is a client who would blame herself about that and feel inadequate and ashamed about that. The suicide items are not a surprise given the suicidal ideation she's had in recent years. She feels helpless. She is got a low self-esteem, a lot of self-doubt, a lot of shame about herself. She feels inefficacious. She feels stressed. And no sort of fears and anxieties that are limiting her and keeping her at home. Her being at home and restricted life is not about being afraid to go out. It's about not having the energy and feeling worthless. Again, we saw on the higher order scale, these externalizing scales are very low. I could kind of joke and say this is a woman who could use a little externalization. Interpersonal passivity high, social avoidance high, shyness and social anxiety high, and disaffiliation low. This is a very painful constellation. A person who feels uncomfortable and shy and socially anxious around other people, but who wants contact with other people. This is a very painful state. She doesn't temperamentally not need people. She needs to be around people but doesn't feel able to and finds it too anxiety-provoking to be around people. Now, some of you are familiar with the Psi-5 scales. I'm quite a fan of them. And you can see here other things we saw in the MMPI. This introversion, this scale is very correlated with RCD, so it's not a surprise that it's high. And with RC2, we see the negative emotionality. But what I want to point out here is notice this low score, lowest possible score, the aggressiveness scale of the RCD. So the average score would be up here, and she's down here. So this is a woman who's very inhibited in her ability to feel anger and aggression and to be assertive. This is the person, I joke, who, if someone steps on their toe, they're going to say, "Excuse me for putting my foot under your foot," instead of saying, "Hey, wait just a minute, Buster, get off my toe." So this is an affect state, an emotional behavioral system that is blocked in this woman, and which I read this MMPI as saying very involved in her depression in contexts where other people would quite rightfully feel incensed, angry, upset, mad at someone else. This is the person who is going to blame themselves, feel apologetic, feel like they created the problem in the interpersonal environment, and not really be able to take steps to call other people to task. I think this is very important in answering her questions. I want to show you some excerpts from the MMPI-2-RF report, which are really was really excellent in this place. In this case, you see the memory problems, difficulties with concentration, history of suicidal ideation. I've highlighted a few things. She's in considerable emotional distress, lack of positive emotional experiences, vegetative signs of depression, all true, lacking self-confidence, feeling useful, very likely to experience self-doubt, feel insecure and inferior. You see the self-doubt scale here. Intrapunitive, what I was just talking about. No indications of maladaptive externalizing behavior. As I said, she could use a little bit, and a below average level of aggressive behavior and anger experiences. Unassertive, submissive. Others are well-intentioned and trustworthy. She's overly trusting. This is that low RC3 scale. And she reports being shy, easily embarrassed, and uncomfortable around others. Now, back to the flowchart. I want to explain this optional step to those of you who aren't familiar with therapeutic assessment. I could go immediately from step 2 to step 4 here and give this client feedback about the MMPI. And I know from my research and my clinical experience it would be very useful to her, and I could probably have a therapeutic impact. But in therapeutic assessment, we developed this optional step, which we call assessment intervention, and I want to tell you the goals of it. So this is the sort of Gestalt therapy step of therapeutic assessment, again, optional, where we want to create an experience for the client where the client might be able to understand things from the MMPI-2-RF and from the experience we give them in the assessment intervention session that they would otherwise find quite difficult to grasp if we went immediately to feedback. And in this case, I think this woman knows she's depressed. I think she knows she's hard on herself. All of that is very accessible to her awareness. I think what would be difficult for her to fully grasp is the block around anger and how it affects her and her lack of assertiveness, which I see, for example, as being very tied into her inability to move forward in getting over this past relationship. This previous partner really ended the relationship in a dastardly way. I won't tell you the details because we don't have time. But Ms. P, instead of feeling angry and incensed and kind of helping use that to say, well, you know, this guy treated me badly, good riddance, is still blaming herself and unable to move forward. So that's why, she, in a way, if you think of the Kubler-Ross grief stages, she can't go through the stages of grief and get to acceptance because she can't do the anger stage. So I wanted to create an example in a living experience with her of her blocks around anger, and so that we could grasp this together and she could see it without me just having to tell her from the MMPI-2-RF. So this was my plan for the assessment intervention session. I pulled picture story cards from the TAT and the Roberts-Apps Perception Test that often pull for stories around anger. From the MMPI-2-RF, again using it as my empathy magnifying glass, I expected that when I gave Ms. P these cards and asked her to tell stories to them, she would tell stories of persons who were internalizing and blamed themselves instead of other people. And that by observing these stories and discussing them together, we might be able to explore these blocks to assertiveness and anger in her. Now, I didn't tell her this was my plan. She came for the session, and I told her that I wanted to do a test that would explore her question, why is it so difficult for me to see myself in positive ways? I thought that was my open door and my entree to start working with her in this way. And then I gave her the standard instructions to the TAT to tell the story to the card I was going to show, to tell me what was happening in the picture, what the person was thinking and feeling, what happened before and what happens afterwards. And I showed her this card, which I had selected because often people tell stories about a boy being frustrated about being made to practice the violin. And this is Ms. P's story. Prior to this, the mother had said that the boy had better practice the violin, and the boy really put up a fight and argued about not wanting to practice. The mother said, you need to. You're taking lessons, so you need to practice, so go sit in your room until you're ready to practice. He's not practicing, sort of to make a point. He's so frustrated that he has to sit in his room with a violin. And how it ends up? It ends up that he half-heartedly practices a little bit and ends up getting away with it. Well, I was quite pleased with this story, and I thought maybe our work that we've been doing so far is actually starting to help Miss P get in touch with a little bit of anger. But you can still see how the anger is blocked in this story. So I wasn't completely wrong about what I expected. I then gave this card to the TAT, card 4. Often there's some kind of angry story. Either the woman is angry or the man, etc. This is Ms. P's story. The man has told his wife that he has to go away to take a job somewhere else, and he's tried to put on a gruff exterior so she won't know how upset he is about that. She's very upset, saying, I won't let you go. I wish you would just stay here. You don't really need to go. And she's pretty desperate about it, not wanting him to leave. And he's trying to keep his emotions in check so as to not show her how much he doesn't want to go. And after this, he does end up leaving, and she's just crushed. So I gave a probe that I thought would illuminate what I was hoping to illuminate. I asked, does she have any thoughts about herself? Maybe she's feeling she could have done something to make him stay. She's not sure what she could have done, but she's thinking if she had just been more persuasive, he would have stayed. The self-blame coming through in this task. I then gave this card. Sometimes people tell a story where someone's being aggressive and strangling someone. I didn't know what she would tell, but prior to this, the older woman started feeling ill, and her daughter, I guess, was really worried about her. And the daughter just doesn't know what to do or how to help and feels really powerless about what she can do. You can see how good our MMPI-2-RF is working. The impotency, interpersonal passivity is right here. And after this, the older woman lies down for a while and still isn't feeling well, and the daughter just wasn't sure whether she should take her to the hospital or what. How does it end up? The daughter ends up taking them out of the hospital where she's gravely ill. Again, I probe. How does the daughter feel about herself? Just bad that she couldn't do more to help, and she wasn't sure if she could have prevented it or she could have gone to the hospital sooner. She doesn't know if she helped enough or did it right. So I then gave this card from the robber self-perception test. Clearly an angry card. Most people tell a story about a girl being angry. Some clients who are really blocked around anger will say she's in an exercise class or she's moving a chair. I was very curious what Ms. P would do. And the anger does come through. Prior to this, the parents told this girl that she was going to go to a different school and that she was going to have to leave her friends and go to a different school. The girl just flew into a rage and said she wasn't going to go and that it wasn't fair and that she just refused. They told her that she didn't have a choice in the matter. She picked up the chair and threw it across the room and just was furious and scared and just didn't know what to do with herself. And after this, she just sort of raged on for a while and finally ended in tears, saying she didn't want to go and that she was afraid to go to a new school. Her parents comforted her but said that she still had to go. What an interesting story. We see anger, discontrol here and the rage coming through. But the way I read it, what happens if you express anger? Nothing. Nobody listens. It doesn't get you anything. Now, after those three stories, I sat back and asked Ms. P, so let's talk about those stories. Do you see any pattern in your stories? And she's a bright woman. She very quickly said, well, yeah, kind of. They're all frustrating situations where people felt powerless and like they kind of either like blamed themselves or blew up and blamed other people. And I said, yeah, and which is more common for you, do you think? And she said, oh, well, I'm far more likely to blame myself. And I said, yeah, so do you think that's related to why it's hard to see yourself in positive ways? She said, absolutely. Yeah, I'm much more aware of my part and focused on that. And I said, so how did that get to be? Tell me, why do you think that is? Like, do these stories tell us anything about what you learned to do with anger? Then a very long story came out that I had not been aware of before about how anger was handled in Ms. P's family. She had a very angry older brother. Her parents and the brother got into long, long arguments that went on for hours when she was a child. He was an adolescent. And I said, gosh, I wonder what you learned from those. And she said, I think I learned to just stay in my room and not say anything and just be good. And I said, so it's kind of interesting that in these stories you can at least see this possibility of expressing anger, but it doesn't look like you see anger as a very helpful thing. And she said, no. And I said, so how did your parents express anger? And then she said, well, my mother is actually a lot like me, blames herself. She came from an angry household, and I think she's really, really hard on herself. And I said, but it sounds like she can also expressing, oh, yeah, there's a lot of slamming of doors and things. Gosh, what was that like for you? Very hard. And again, I wonder what you learned from that. Well, maybe it's better to just hold it in. Then I said, so let's do an experiment. Are you willing? Let's take some of these stories where the people are blaming themselves and see if you can tell a story where they don't blame themselves and where they're either angry or they don't explode with anger, but they sort of find a middle road. And we practiced for about 10 or 15 minutes with me helping her in a scaffolding way to tell stories. And she said, gosh, that feels pretty good to imagine that possibility. Then I said, so want to do another experiment? I mean, we could just stop here, but what would it be like to take your partner C, put him in that chair over there, and talk to him about how you felt about the way he ended the relationship? And we worked together for about 10 minutes with me kind of supporting and mirroring and saying, yeah, that's good. Can you do a little more? And Ms. P finally was able to say, I'm really pissed off with you about the way you ended the relationship. And I stopped and said, how does that feel? She said, good. I feel more solid. I feel better. And the next day when she came back, she told me she had had her best night's sleep in years after this session. So you can see the purpose for these assessment intervention sessions. We use our MMPI-2-RF as an empathy magnifier to show us where the client's blocks are. Then, rather than just telling the client where they're blocked, we put together an experience using other tests in a soft way, or role plays, or drawing exercises to explore what we know from the MMPI, but in a way that the client can grasp it, experience it in vivo as a living example, and that this helps them answer their own questions. Then we're ready for step 4, what we call summary discussion sessions. We don't call them feedback sessions because feedback to me has this idea of the guy in the white coat telling you the truth about yourself from the test, and that's not at all the feeling that we want. We want a dialogue. I'll say more about this, a summary and a discussion. And the goals are to use the test to lay out a new, coherent, compassionate, more accurate story for the client about their problems and living, answer the client's questions for the assessment, engage the client in corroborating and modifying the test interpretations. The MMPI says this might be the answer to your question, what do you think? We work hard not to overwhelm clients or get them defensive. And clients, again, often have affective breakthroughs in these sessions, and we don't want to just quickly move on to our next point in the outline. We stop, we support them, we talk about what they're feeling as this new information comes in. And we want the client to feel held up, respected, understood, and valued. Now, there are 5 main principles from our research that I want to go over quickly about preparing for and conducting a summary discussion session. First, adapt your language, tone, and examples to the particular client. And you'd use not only your MMPI-2-RF, but all the testing and interviews at your disposal to tailor the session to the client. If the client has a very high verbal IQ but very low visual performance skills, you may not show the profile. You may just talk to the client. If your client has a low VCI but is very strong, make sure you show that profile, and that will be very meaningful to the client. If your client is an engineer, use engineering metaphors. If your client is a farmer, use farming metaphors. If your client is a little more psychopathically organized, speak bluntly from the hip, very strongly. If your client is internalizing and self-punitive, be very careful about how the client might distort your words to make themselves, in their mind, be worse. And check, how are you hearing what I'm saying? Oh, I'm hearing that I'm a terrible failure and that there's no hope for me. Oh, very interesting, because I didn't say that. One of the biggest things we learned in our research in therapeutic assessment is that how you order the information you present in a summary discussion session greatly affects your client's ability to take in the information, understand it, and use it in their lives. And we have a schema that we call the level 1, 2, 3 information. So as I'm looking at an MMPI-2-RF, and I'm saying, gosh, she's very depressed, she's very internalizing, I'm asking myself, how familiar is this information? How congruent is it with the client's existing story about herself? And is this what we call level 1 information, something the client already knows and thinks about himself or herself? When we tell this information to a client, they say, that sounds just like me, and you can still get them to give examples. This is level 1 information. It should be the first information you try to tell the client in the summary discussion session. After some of that, which meets the need for self-verification, we try to present MMPI-2-RF results, test results, that are less congruent with the client's previous existing story, but which won't cause disintegration or shame or major anxiety attacks. These are ways of modifying, amplifying the client's usual ways of thinking about themselves, but which won't cause psychological crisis. Most of what we try to do in an MMPI-2-RF feedback is talk about this kind of feedback, bringing in research findings, bringing in what we know about people who score high on this, but elaborating things that are not so strange for the client, but putting meat on the bones of what they already know. Here's where knowing the research about the various scales and attending the workshops where you can hear the experts talk about what these scales mean will really help you. And we save information that we call level 3 that are so novel or discrepant from the client's usual ways of thinking about themselves, and we present it later in the session after we've gone over a lot of level 1 and level 2 information. And if you think back to assessment intervention sessions, the goal of assessment intervention sessions, in a sense, is to take information from a test that is likely to be level 3 information and that the client might reject, and give the client an experience so it becomes level 2 information or level 1 information and is more easily discussed and grasped in a collaborative summary discussion session. Another clue is to reword findings to make use of clients' personal symbolic metaphors. So I could use excerpts from Ms. P's TAT stories. So instead of just saying, you're likely to blame yourself, the MMPI-2-RF says, I could say, you'll be like the person in the TAT story who does everything you can to get the person to the hospital, but then wonders afterwards if you could have done more. If you have a Rorschach on the client, you can pull images from Rorschach responses and use them as metaphors. You don't even have to remind the client where the information has come from. It's speaking to the client in their personal symbolic language. And as I mentioned earlier, our research is very clear. For a summary discussion session to have a therapeutic impact, you want to dialogue with the client about the findings. Here is your question. This is what the MMPI-2-RF suggests. What do you think? Oh, you agree. Can you think of an example of how that shows up? Oh, it doesn't seem right. Is there anything about what I said that seems right? Is there any context in what that says? Oh, thank you. You're helping me. That occurs in this context, but not that context. Great. Thank you. This is really helping me understand. And never, ever, ever argue about a finding. For many reasons, you might be wrong. You might have not understood that MMPI-2-RF scale. or the client isn't ready to hear it. And it's not going to be useful to insist on something the client isn't ready to hear. Now, a quick summary of Ms. P's session. I showed her MMPI-2-RF profile. I oriented her to reading the scales. I thought it would be very useful to show her her profile. And I reordered her questions because I thought the level 1 information would be more easily referenced with this question 3. What's keeping me from getting out more to do things? And I showed Ms. P her RCD scale elevation, her RC2, and her low score on RC9. And I said, these are very extreme scores. You're scoring really high. This RC2 is a 99.9 percentile. And this low RC9, a lot of people with scores this low are having trouble getting out of bed. Very interestingly, I found out this was not level 1 information from Ms. P. She was kind of shocked at the level of distress on her MMPI. And we had to sort of work together with that. And we came to understand that she had been kind of accustomed to her depression. She didn't realize how severe it was. It had been her state. It was like a gray coat she had put on and forgot, with lead weights in it, that she had forgotten that she had on. And she no longer could even imagine what it was like to take it off. She was particularly touched by my saying that I was amazed that she was still doing everything she was doing. And she said to me that it was really, really good that the MMPI showed she wasn't just being a baby and that she couldn't just power through this, that it really, really was a serious clinical matter. I then addressed her question 1, in work situations, why don't I feel like I'm contributing in spite of evidence to the contrary? And I showed her her high cognitive complaint score and told her about how people with this level of depression often feel very fuzzy, they can't concentrate, and that depression really can affect our cognitive abilities, but that most people didn't know that. And I said I was wondering if she could tell that she wasn't running on all cylinders. And this was very difficult. And as a bright person, she could still kind of cover, but that it was very hard to have the sense. And that I could see how she might have found it intolerable and left her job. This was a great relief to her, and also the fact that this could be tied to depression. And if her depression improved, then possibly that this aspect of her experience could also improve. I then took the next question, how can I move past the intense feelings of grief about my last romantic relationship? And I went right to the aggression score and the aggressiveness scale score on the Sci-5 that I talked to you about. And I used that phrase about, you're the person who, when someone steps on your toe, will say, excuse me for putting my foot under your foot. And she laughed. And then we related this to how this was adaptive in her family, but that it wasn't that adaptive in the world now. And we had this vivid experience of the assessment intervention session to relate to, and she had this experience that expressing anger at her previous partner in the empty chair had helped her feel better and have the best night's sleep that she'd ever had. And I said, and you deserve to be mad. He treated you badly. This is not a respectful way. I took the opportunity here to also talk about her low score on RC3, and I said, I wonder if you're not through with this relationship because you're also still trying to get all the lessons you can out of it. And, this score says you might tend to give people way too much a benefit of the doubt. And again, blame yourself rather than see their part in things. And when you think back on it, this dastardly way he ended the relationship, did you have any signs earlier that he might be the kind of person who could do this? And she said, oh my gosh, what a good question. Now that I think about it, there were signs, but of course I just dismissed them and said, it's all me and I'm just taking it too personally. And I said, yes, and now when you look back, maybe this is the kind of stuff you have to learn to pay attention to make it safe to be in intimate relationships. And she really said that was a useful thing to think about, and she could see that. And I said, this is something to work on in therapy. The last question, what prevents me from seeing myself in positive ways? I brought in 4 things. Her depression predisposed her to think negatively. As previously discussed, she had a tendency to blame herself. I also spent a lot of time talking about the high self-doubt score. You know, this is a general self-esteem and shame scale, and her high score suggested that she basically had a core story about herself, that she was not lovable. And I said, you know, there are lots of reasons why people can end up like this, but I'm just curious, you know, this is often related to people not getting really the kind of nurturing and attention in their families that they need growing up. And I'm not trying to beat up on your parents here, but I just wonder, what do you know? And she told me a story of a mother who'd been very depressed at times, then the sort of involvement of her parents with her brother. Her father was working a lot, and that maybe she just didn't get the kind of focus from them. And she said this would be something for her to think about. And I was very careful not to put her into a defensive place by criticizing her parents, but to say, I'm sure they're good people, I'm sure they tried the best they could, but this is something for you to explore in therapy. And then we also talked about how people around Ms. P kept trying to cheer her up, her family, other people. If she talked about her depression, they'd say, oh, but that's not so bad. Look on the bright side here, and how this could make her feel bad about her depression. We discussed next steps, revisiting her medication with her psychiatrist, working on being more skeptical and being more assertive and being more in touch with anger in her therapy, and we said goodbye. She expressed a lot of appreciation at the end of the summary discussion session. The next step in MMPI-2-RF is to provide written feedback to the client. And those of you who are familiar with the model will know, instead of writing a standard psychological report, what we tend to do, when possible, is to write a letter to the client where we refer to ourselves in first person, we speak to them in second person, and it's a way to answer the client's questions in writing, remind them of the material that we went over in the summary discussion session. And in the letter, we liberally reference their collaboration. I said this to you. You brought in this point. You helped me see this. We write it very jargon-free, and if we refer to MMPI-2-RF scales, we reference them and decode them so it's not full of jargon. And I'm not going to be able to read it completely, but I've put in your handouts excerpts from my report to Ms. P. And you can see it's written as a letter. And the answers to the questions are in the order that I did them in the summary discussion session. What's keeping me from getting more to do things? You may remember we discussed this with reference to your scores on the MMPI-2-RF. Your scores indicated that you're in a lot of emotional pain and extremely depressed. More than 999 of 1,000 people walk around in the streets. You also scored extremely low on an energy scale. Next paragraph. You were a bit surprised at the level of these scores, but you agreed that things associated with such scores were true of you. So I even referenced her surprise in the session. Here you can get more detail about what I told her in the summary discussion session in work situations. And again, I referred to the mental fuzziness that we saw in the cognitive complaint scale. How can I move past the intense feelings of grief? Again, I first want to validate that you were steamrolled. That was the word she used. By the way, your partner ended the relationship. He really broke your heart, and you haven't recovered. And as we discussed, I think there's a natural set of emotions, anger, righteous indignation, and entitlement that have been hard for you to have so far in your life because of some of the things in your family. moving quickly through this so we have time for questions. What's preventing me from seeing myself in positive ways? Suggestions, specific suggestions for what to work on in therapy. And to go back to her psychiatrist and, again, revisit the medication. And a perfect thing to say to an internalizing, self-critical client, go slow, be patient, don't set the bar too high. Try to take what you've learned here and go slow. And this way, Nancy, your therapist, can support you as you make these changes. So that was the letter that I sent. I also asked her to fill out some feedback forms and return them to me about her experience of the assessment. And I did do the following optional step, which is the follow-up sessions. Tell you a little bit about that. 2 months after the feedback, she and I met for a follow-up session. She was a lot better. She was taking a new antidepressant medication, and she had been working in therapy on being aware of and expressing anger. And she told me the relief that she felt was almost physical. I knew this from the referring professional who had told me how the assessment had really pivoted the therapy, and Ms. P was doing much better. And on the client feedback forms, Ms. P wrote, "This assessment exceeded my expectations. I gained more insight into my feelings and situation than I had hoped. This was an excellent experience. From your help with formulating questions through the feedback session, I gained a great deal that will help my therapist and me in our work together. Thank you." In closing, these are some other resources about therapeutic assessment. I have an old book published in 1996 about using the MMPI-2 in therapeutic assessment, but it can easily be extended into the MMPI-2-RF. There are many articles that can be downloaded from our therapeutic assessment website, including some of the research articles that I talked about. You can join on our website, the Therapeutic Assessment Institute, for a small fee, and you get our biannual newsletter. You receive discounts to our consultation and our training workshops. And there's also a DVD published a couple years ago on the American Psychological Association Psychotherapy Series, where I give feedback to an actual client on her MMPI-2-RF. And you can click on this link and purchase the DVD. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm going to stop talking now, and I think we have about 15 minutes for your questions that I'll try to respond to. And thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Finn. This is Deb. Can you hear me?
I can, Deb. Thank you.
Oh, excellent. What a great session. I want to thank you so much for taking time today to share that with us. We just sent a call out for questions. Yep, we do have a call out to questions, and I do have some to start with, but if folks are still typing, feel free. We should have some time here. So going back to the beginning of your presentation when you were talking sort of about some of the outcomes that are expected with therapeutic assessment, can you speak to any understanding that you have with the relationship between improved outcomes in placebo and what does follow-up look like? And maybe if that's not like a clear enough question, whoever submitted that one, if you need some additional information, just let them know what you would like clarified in that question.
So what I can tell you is the outcomes that I referenced are from two types of designs, group comparison studies where therapeutic assessment was either compared to traditional assessment or another credible treatment. Some of the studies actually pitted therapeutic assessment against treatment. So, and there was a significant group difference between the outcomes with the therapeutic assessment helping the clients, or some of them were time series analyses where clients are compared to themselves over time with a long baseline and a long follow-up. And some of the group comparison studies also have follow-ups also. What we know is that in many cases in the studies that have been done, the positive benefits of the therapeutic assessment are maintained over follow-up. We have several studies where the follow-ups even go considerably longer than a month or so. And in a number of studies, the outcomes seem to increase in the month or two after the assessment. The biggest benefits are not found immediately after the assessment, but several months after the assessment is completed. And this isn't very typical for psychological interventions. So we've been quite intrigued by that. And I published a paper this last year with my colleague Jan Kamphuis from the University of Netherlands, where we talk about the empirical evidence from therapeutic assessment and these delayed outcomes and try to explain it. That's an article in the Journal of Personality Assessment, 2018, Finn and Kamphuis, and the article has epistemic trust in the title.
Okay. So now kind of going to some logistical questions that people have just about the process. Do you typically have the client fill out the MMPI in your office? And if so, like how much time are you usually scheduling for that?
Yeah. Well, here's a lovely thing about the MMPI-2-RF. Most clients can complete it in about 45 minutes. And you can either use the paper and pencil presentation and put the client in the waiting room or have them come a little early for their second appointment, or you can have the online administration of the MMPI-2-RF and hand the client a laptop or have them go into a testing room with a computer and fill out the MMPI. And so it's a very, very nice thing. And it doesn't, take most clients that long. With adolescent clients using the MMPI-A-RF or the MMPI-A, I have found the online administration to be really user-friendly for them and gets better attention than asking them to sit down with bubble sheets and a booklet. And so with adolescents, I almost always use the online administration.
So then moving along to the assessment intervention and discussion sessions, how much time do you usually schedule for those discrete sessions?
Usually about an hour. If I have a more involved therapeutic assessment that uses more than the MMPI-2, then I might have intellectual testing to go over or projective testing, et cetera, to fit together in the picture. I might do an hour and a half. But I think for an MMPI-2-RF session, initial session you can get it done usually in about an hour. Your assessment intervention session can be 45 minutes to an hour, and your summary discussion session can be an hour. So you have a 3-hour intervention, or if you leave out the assessment intervention, a 2-hour intervention.
Okay. Taking us to your case study, there's a question here about if the client were to have been so significantly cognitively blocked that she was unable to see the themes that were emerging, what would have you maybe done differently?
Well, then I think I would have stepped in and said, I think I'm seeing a theme here. Let me put it out and see if you think I might be right. So again, the collaborative approach is to not come in as white coat expert with the truth, but to sort of work with the client, but give little pieces of help. And so if she had said, well, I'm not really sure if I see a theme, I'd say, well, I think I see, it looks like everybody's dealing with frustrating situations here. Do you see that? Oh, yes. And do you notice anything about how they're dealing with that? And so doing these sort of little half steps to see if I could help the client climb up on the observation deck and begin to see a pattern that will be useful to discuss.
Okay, so kind of a related question here just came in. What do you think are the best resources describing the extended inquiry or intervention sessions involving storytelling cards?
My book, my 2007 book, In Our Client's Shoes, is a good place to start. And many of the published case studies on therapeutic assessment have published excerpts of actual dialogue of clients in extended inquiries and in assessment intervention sessions. So, and this recent article that I mentioned on the epistemic trust has long excerpts in there of actual client sessions with extended inquiries and assessment intervention sessions.
So I think a related question to that one is many of us have relied on Levack, Siegel, and Nichols' book for therapeutic feedback using the MMPI-2 for therapeutic assessment language to use with clients for the RF. What similar resources would you recommend? And I know you put a slide up on some of the resources. Is there anything in addition to what's on the slide that you put up?
Yeah. I don't have anything to push right now. I mean, the way I have become familiar with the MMPI-2-RF, being a longtime MMPI-2 user, was to attend the training workshops by the University of Minnesota, to read Yossi Ben-Porres' book on the MMPI, interpreting the MMPI-2-RF, to work with my clients. And again, the scales are very homogeneous and easily described. So I think as you begin to talk with clients about this, that'll help fill in the gaps. So.
Okay. Here's a question about your experience. I guess they're just trying to understand what your experience is working with such a structured and standardized assessment like the MMPI combined with the apperceptive assessments that you've gone over today.
I'll need a little more to understand that question.
Okay. Well, whoever submitted it, if there's a little bit more description that you can provide around what you're trying to get at, we'll try to get that answered for you. In the meantime, let's go on to...
I should maybe jump in and just say, there was a very quick and dirty description of assessment intervention sessions. And using one example of TAT and picture story cards of how you can do that. But it's a more involved step, and you can use a variety of techniques in assessment intervention sessions. But the general idea is to create an experience for the client based on what we know from the MMPI-2-RF that will help them grasp what we know, but before we have to present it to them in the summary discussion session. And there's a million ways to do it.
Okay, thanks for that. So the last two questions that we have are kind of related to the end of the sessions. So do you believe therapeutic assessment a useful way to start treatment with the assessor as the therapist, or do you believe that it's best utilized for brief therapy or when a client is stuck with their own therapist?
I think it's a very flexible intervention that can be used in many ways. So many clients who come, if they're not in incredible crisis and can sort of tolerate taking an MMPI and going through an assessment, this can be a really great way to start a therapy. And I have experienced no problems continuing with those clients if I have room in my practice in psychotherapy afterwards. And we repeatedly go back to what we learned in the therapeutic assessment and carry it forward. But MMPI-2-RF can be done. You could do this brief therapeutic assessment and then refer to another therapist who you then convey this information to. And again, what our research shows is clients arrive in the new therapy with better alliance to the new professional, more aware of what they need to work on, and more aware of what steps they need to take, and that it gives a boost to the next therapy. But as the other part of the question, we find therapists who are stuck with clients, like in my case example, can refer a client to a therapeutic assessment, and then the client will go back to the psychotherapy, and the rate of change will increase after that.
Okay. Question here about are there still therapeutic assessment conferences? I think you may have mentioned something about that. We do an
international therapeutic assessment conference every 3 years. So we did one in 2017. There will be another one in 2020. We haven't yet figured out the place, but we'll be announcing it. We present at the Society for Personality Assessment, many of us, and if you go on the TAI website, you'll see lists of the trainings that we do around the world. If there isn't a training in your area and you would like an individual consultation with a TAI faculty member, you can email us through the website and we'll hook you up. And if you're a TAI member, you get a discount in the rate you pay for those consultations.
Great. And then finally, we have a question about the new testing codes that are coming in January. Are you comfortable indicating if such services, TA services, would be covered and how you would code them?
I'm just getting familiar with those. So, but in general, I can tell you that I believe some aspects of therapeutic assessment, like summary discussion sessions and assessment intervention sessions, can actually be billed as psychotherapy. And it is therapy. So, but I can't give a more precise answer right now. So.
All right. Well, I think that wraps up the questions that we have at this point. People always have an opportunity to, if they have one last thought, there is a survey that you will get as you exit the webinar. So please give us your feedback, and if there's any additional questions or concerns that you have that you'd like Pearson or Dr. Finn to address, let us know, and we'll do our best to get back to you. Again, if you were attending this and you wanted to receive the complimentary continuing education credit, we will be sending folks an evaluation form. All you need to do is fill that out and send it back to the address on the form, and we will get you that continuing education credit within 10 business days. So I want to thank you, Dr. Finn, very much for sharing your expertise with everyone today.
And thank you, and thanks to Pearson and to everyone who listened. I hope it was useful to you in your work. So.
Absolutely, and I want to thank everybody who attended and for their interest in this topic, and look for more to come. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.